if you prefer to process, at a certain point, you run out of lived material.
Yeah.
You have to go live a little bit more in order to have more like new ground to process.
Well, you don't have to. You just get real weird.
Yeah. Right.
You're like,
real insular.
you got all these weird abstract ideas and home with your cats on the internet. You're like, that guy's got off the rails pretty hardcore. Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So this week on the show, we're going to talk about the radical nature of the 8 Jungian cognitive functions of personality.
Sounds intense.
Sounds so technical, doesn't it? So if you've been around Personality Hacker at all for any length of time, you know that we don't just stop at the 4 letters for your personality: introversion versus extroversion, sensing intuitive, thinker feeler, judge or perceiver. We go the layer deeper. We talk about all the time our CAR model of personality, which comes from our owner's manuals. There's an owner's manual at personalhacker.com for every single personality type. You should get yours. It's fantastic. It's got a lot of growth frameworks in there for your relationships, career, personal identity, and worldview. So go do that. That'd be great over at personalhacker.com. But in there, we have a CAR model, and we talk about the 4 cognitive functions that drive your personality. So no matter what your personality is, you have to relate to all 8 of these functions in the world and the energies they represent. But your personality is attuned to 4 primarily, and 2 are strengths and 2 are challenges or uncertainties in your life. We just came through a series talking about how each personality type can show themselves love, and we went through the CAR model for each type. So you should be able to reference that most recently on those shows. Also, you can get the same material, even more, in the owner's manual for your type. So what do I mean when I say radical nature of cognitive functions? So cognitive functions are the mental processes that we use to learn information or perceive our world, and then we use to make a decision or evaluative criteria about that information that we perceive. And we split them into 8, and we've got, there's qualitative nature to all these. But really, Antonio, we could, if you wanted to, for a thought exercise today, and it's not even just a thought exercise, this is the radical nature of it. You could reduce things down. Like, for example, feeling. We talk about authenticity, nickname. Technical name is introverted feeling. And then we talk about feeling harmony, which is technically extroverted feeling. So we got this concept of introverted feeling and extroverted feeling. But we could be more radical and say, let's just talk about the function of feeling at all.
So I just want to make it clear, because the word radical usually evokes a very specific thought in people's minds.
Oh, like protest or something like that, you mean? Like, radicals at the gates, yeah. They're going to storm the castle.
But we're talking about it in terms of fundamental.
The definition of the word radical.
Right.
Not how it's been used now in political discourse.
Right, exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
my apologies.
Fundamental nature of the functions.
All right, here we go. We're going to talk today about the fundamental nature
there you go.
of the Jungian cognitive functions. There you go.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we want to do that, well, it's twofold. First, there's when people are first learning the functions, and I think most type communities at this point, if you run into personality type information through the internet, you're probably going to run into information about the functions.
Mm-hmm.
They're the backbone of the Myers-Briggs system. They're where it all started, and they provide so much insight into type, right? Into understanding your personality type, why you're doing what you're doing beyond just like a generic profile or a generic description.
Yeah.
They provide a lot of texture, and they're basically, it's like a rabbit's hole that never ends.
Yes.
I've been studying Jungian functions for going on 2 decades now, and I still haven't reached the end of it.
Yeah, and you could almost see there's people who know about the Myers-Briggs personality type system that don't understand functions, and then there's people that have taken a couple extra minutes and have gone down to understand functions. And you could see this expressed by that video. It came out years ago on, I think it was Vox. Why the Myers-Briggs system is BS.
Right.
It's like, you can't distill people down to these binary traits of extroversion versus introversion. And then you look at the comments.
Yeah.
Every comment underneath are people that did like 5 more minutes of research than the person that put the video together.
Right.
And they go, you're completely missing the point.
Right.
Functions, cognitive functions, and just down the line, every comment. Look at cognitive functions, guys. You don't even understand what you're talking about.
Right.
Because they're dismissing the whole system before they even understand the depth that it has.
Exactly.
That's what you're speaking to.
Yes. Yeah. And thank goodness, actually, because when we first got in the game, which feels like a million years ago now.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
That's how old we are now.
We're much younger folk. at the time, it didn't feel like functions were everywhere. In fact, I remember speaking at a live event in 2009, I want to say 2009, 2010, where there were people in the audience who had, they were MBTI certified and people who were there for specifically a type conference talking about cognitive functions. And I don't think anybody in the audience had really heard of them. Now, this wasn't like, it wasn't like an APT, right? So these weren't people who are more
Yeah.
well versed. They were just people who were like casual, but they would say that they were knowledgeable about type.
Yeah.
And even they didn't know about type at that time. Fast forward 15 years later, and I would say that it's a very different context. Now, the challenge though is and I think this is why for a long time it was considered a more esoteric part of type, is that there's a barrier of entry to really understanding these functions. It's the beautiful thing about them. It's why you won't hit the end of it, right? It's like they just keep going and going and going in insight and wisdom because they're not behavioral. They're cognitive, right?
Yeah.
It's studying the mind, which the mind has so many different facets to it. And so the thing that is a feature is also a bug, right? Which is the feature is that it's endless. It's like a model that can be endlessly flayed out.
Yeah.
The bug is that there is a barrier of entry to really understanding the nature of each of those 8 functions. And so you'll see a lot more awareness around functions, but you'll also see a lot more, say, battles about the definitions of them and the meaning of them.
Yes.
And so, so I was saying there's 2 reasons why we wanted to record this.
Yeah.
And the first one is addressing why, or like a way that it could be understood that makes it a little bit more simple.
Yeah.
For whether or not your definitions are stepping on the territory of specific functions. So take, for example, introverted feeling or authenticity, what we call authenticity, and extroverted feeling or what we call harmony. A person will say, I did a thing, right? I did this thing. Is that introverted feeling or is that extroverted feeling? And there can be some confusion about like when do we cross over into the other side's territory?
Yeah.
And because there's a barrier of entry here, it can be very difficult to create clean lines.
Yeah. So by the way, just a note, we accommodate this in our 2 flagship programs that help people understand these functions. One's a personal relationship to the functions, our personality life path mentorship. We understand it's hard to articulate or see this in a cerebral way, so we do it experientially. We take 8 weeks, and every week we tune into one of the functions, its energy, and how it's represented. And we help create an experience for the students going through that course to go play that function out in their life that week, find out their relationship to it, where no matter what their personality type wiring is. And we do that for 8 weeks, all of those functions. And then our profiler training program and events, because we're teaching in that. So that personal life path is to help people understand their personal relationship with the functions in a personal growth framework, making their life path. Profiler training, personality profiler training, teaching people how to have a conversation with somebody to help determine their best fit type. It's a very subjective personal experience with another human. You also have to understand the functions too experientially, because as you're talking to someone, you can't be theorizing. You have to really tune into what's showing up for them to help them determine their best fit type. So we do what's called embodiment exercises, where we, again, in a in a seminar or workshop format, we do small experiences with our students to help them understand the nucleus or the expression or energy of that function, to feel it, to experience it fully. That, I believe, is the best way to learn about these functions, is experientially.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think that's why you don't ever hit the end of the rabbit's trail, is because there's the theory of a function and then there's the experience of a function.
Yes.
There's the actual, like the relationship an individual has. And that, because there's so many, I mean, there's almost 8 billion humans on the planet now. So there's nearly 8 billion flavors of how functions can show up, right? Because it's the lens through which we're experiencing our world, our individual world. So I think the first reason why we wanted to record this podcast is to talk to some of those confusions, right? Like, when are we crossing over into another function's territory, and how would we know? And the second reason is because this is like a bit of a theory that I've thrown together. Like, I'm kind of working on it, and I don't know if it's entirely accurate, but I always work on theories out loud on the podcast anyway. So I figured this would be a great opportunity to do so. So the first reason is to clear up confusion. And the second reason is to introduce a way of looking at it that might create more confusion if I'm inaccurate, but let's see what happens.
Yeah. Well, we're also going to stress test it our next PLP.
We will be.
We're going to be testing it with real clients and seeing how they take to it as well.
Yep.
Okay. So as we talk about this, the radical nature, the fundamental nature of personality, cognitive functions.
Mhm.
So how do you want to approach this today? Do you want to talk about, reduce it down to 4 and let's just talk about sensing, feeling, thinking, I literally am
Intuition?
like intuition. Thank you. My sensing's off. I couldn't remember the category. Yeah. Do you want to just talk about them in that way and remove the attitudes? How do you think is the best way to approach this?
Yeah. So let's take it as opposed to other podcast episodes where we've drilled down further. I think I want to bring it up a little higher and talk about them in more sort of general terms, but then get to the nucleus of those more general concepts. So when I say in another podcast we've drilled down, I mean, if you start slicing and dicing these functions, in one of the episodes we talked about how each of the cognitive functions actually shows up with 2 different flavors. So each of the 8 functions can be expressed in either analytic or assertive way, or it can be in a more receptive or holistic way. And so then now that takes 8 cognitive functions and then dices them down into basically 16 different expressions.
Yeah.
And so that's drilling down further and further and further. But I want to take it up to, like you just mentioned, a more fundamental place. And that is the way that these functions were introduced was actually in sets of 4, like you just mentioned, which is that there was an intuiting function. And then that function was considered having 2 different expressions, one being an introverted expression or relationship to self, and one being an extroverted expression or relationship to the outside world, and so on. So there's really 4 functions, and those have 2 different ways of expressing or manifesting.
We call those attitudes.
Exactly.
And so the little I or the E next to the letter,
Mm-hmm.
introverted intuition would be expressed N, capital N for intuition, and a lowercase I for its attitude.
Right. And if you're new to all of this and you see that as shorthand, that's why, right? It's why it's a capital S for sensing and a lowercase I or a lowercase E for introversion or extroversion, because that's like it's not an afterthought, but it's kind of an afterthought, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's an orientation, or like you mentioned, an attitudinal direction.
Well, yeah, and in airplanes, when your nose in airplanes up or down, they call that an attitude when you're flying an airplane. So it's basically the direction it's pointed.
Mhm.
Is it pointed inwardly or is it pointed outwardly?
Right, exactly. So if there's 4 functions, those 4 functions being intuition, sensing, thinking, and feeling, as you mentioned before. Sensing and intuition are what are called perceiving functions. So they're how we take in information and understand the world. And the thinking and feeling functions are judging, or their decision making. And so what I think the sort of the working theory, and one of the ways to be able to create distinctions around which function am I using, or which attitudinal direction am I expressing, if I'm using, say, feeling, right? And I maybe, I don't know, I have a crusade, right? I have a crusade. And I think this is super duper, super important. And I'm going to be on this crusade because this is part of what I think is, like this is, I'm an ally, or I have, this is my activism, or perhaps this is my religious paradigm, or perhaps this is my political persuasion. And so I'm manifesting this crusade in the outside world. Well, is this introverted feeling because it's associated with conviction? Or is this extroverted feeling because now I'm moving it into the outside world and I think that this is how everybody should be living, right? Which one is it? So when you get to the behavioral aspect, things start to feel like they're crossing over, and as I mentioned before, into each other's territory.
Yeah.
Right? Which one is this? Is communication introverted thinking through articulation and expressing of my thoughts? Or is it extroverted thinking because now I'm interfacing with the outside world and I'm giving direction, right? And I'm trying to create clarity for other people. So is communication of thought, is this introverted thinking or is it extroverted thinking? And again, things get kind of murky.
Accuracy versus effectiveness.
Right, exactly.
Just for people that are following along nicknames.
Right, exactly. So I thought that well, I'll introduce this thing that I'm working on.
Let's do it.
It's very kind of, this is like maybe an oversimplified way of thinking about it, but Obviously, this episode is already for either people who are new or people who would like to communicate to their friends and family ways of explaining these functions. Because sometimes, when somebody goes, okay, tell me about this type thing you're into, and they start explaining the functions, sometimes it can break down real fast
Yeah.
because, again, there's a barrier of entry to understanding them. And then there's an even higher barrier of entry to like explaining them in a way that others can really pick up. So here's the way that I've been seeing it lately. The extroverted expression of functions, it's about living them, right? When we extrovert something, we are interfacing with the outside world. And as soon as you start interfacing with the outside world, there's rules that we associate with the concept of living. So the rule is that now we're on a timeline, that we're now engaged with other people, that we are now being observed, that we're now responding to how we're being observed, right? That we're being influenced, that we're influencing others. That's what engagement is. And we can call that life, right? That's what living is. Living is interfacing on a timeline with other people, influencing them, being influenced by them, and having an experience of this thing. So the premise of this concept is that all the extroverted functions are about living those functions out.
Yeah.
Whereas the introverted expression of these functions is about processing what has been lived. So the introverted version is the version that is held and contained within the self. It's the inside element of it. It's introverted. It's contained inside of yourself. And so because of that, well, what are you doing when you go inside? You're processing, you're thinking, you're feeling, you're imagining, you're ruminating. That's right. You're reminiscing. When you go inside, you're not actually living or interfacing with the outside world. And so it doesn't feel like there's as many rules, but you are doing a form of processing. You're kind of creating new neural pathways sometimes, or you're revisiting an old neural pathway. And you're doing a sense of like figuring out the implications or the meaning of what has been lived.
Yeah. And immediately, just that idea of there's this inner space, and we're applying functions to them, these 4 introverted Jungian cognitive functions. But we could just say there's an inner space where I process what happens to me and my experiences. And there's an outer space where I have those experiences. That's what you're saying. There's these 2 ways of being.
Right.
Outer doing, inner processing, or inner being,
right,
in a way. And when you're on the inner space, again, I want to just make sure I understand what you're saying too, and stretch this and land this for somebody listening. You're basically saying, well, by definition, there's not an external reality you have to project onto your inner space. Meaning, inside of me, time doesn't actually exist. Things can be asynchronous. They can happen. In other words, I can be having multiple things happening at once within inside of me because they don't have to happen on a timeline outside of me. They don't have to happen taking into factor things like the law of gravity or time itself or anything. Like anything inside of me is more seemingly malleable and free of any constraints. That's it. It seems that way when you start to talk about the inner space. You think, yeah, in your inner world, you can have any possibility at all.
Yeah, it feels like there are fewer rules. And we did a podcast a while back, it's been a few years now, called Cognitive Functions in Time.
Yeah.
And we discussed that the introverted functions have a very different relationship to time because time doesn't have to live inside of us.
Yeah.
In fact, we are time travelers when we go inside. We jump from the present to the past to the future within seconds. Right?
Yes.
And so there is no time inside of us except for whatever we imagine. So when you go inside, this concept of processing or collating doesn't live in this, or doesn't have the same rules as extroverting something, which forces us to interface with laws of nature, laws of science.
Well, and one could also argue, I mean, just again, first pass at this, that the only inner rules that we have are ones that are projected inwardly from the outer world. Mm-hmm. In other words, the only reason I would maybe be ruminating and reviewing my day and feel any pressure to stop doing that in the inner space is there's some outer requirement of me, like my kids need something, or you want to talk to me, or I'm tired, I got to get, well, maybe that's an internal thing, but something happens where I've got to do something in the outer world. So it disrupts my inner space. Otherwise, it could probably go on indefinitely in the inner space.
Yeah, or rules that have been inferred
Yeah.
Like I'm not allowed to think about certain things.
Yeah.
I might process a thought, I might process concepts, but I've put limitations on my ability to think about certain things because something in the outside world told me that those ideas are verboten.
Yeah.
So we might also introject rules and laws in our inner space.
Right.
But those are chosen. Like even if somebody told us to not not think about something in our inner space,
Yes.
we still allowed that to come through. We still we vetted that one as one that we're going to adopt. And so we still chose to absorb it. Even though it was implied from the outside world, we inferred it and then we took upon ourselves. So
Yes.
the only rules and laws that live in the inner space are the ones that we adopt.
And I would say the final thing I'll say before we go to the next level is there are people that believe it is their job to introject those rules into you.
Yeah.
For example, I was raised in a religious paradigm that told me my inner thoughts and feelings were wrong and against God. And I had a problem that I had to fix within myself. I didn't necessarily feel that from within. That was told to me from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
We were in a family center here in town last week with our kids doing family activities like, racquetball and weightlifting and swimming. It's a family center we go to for the gym and other activities. And there's a big poster on the wall about checking your inner bias as a human. We all have inner biases and prejudices, and we all have to check these inner biases, and you have them, and you got to put them in check. And I'm going, wow, that looks just like the religious days I grew up with. They're trying to project into me the bias that they think is a problem, and they're trying to put it onto me and say that I have it too, and I need to go on the hunt for it, just like the old sin in my life in the past. Mm-hmm. I'm going, that doesn't feel right to me. Like my inner space rejects this notion of the outer world trying to colonize me, right? It tries to colonize my inner space, and I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to happen. Of course, I'm more innerly wired, right? As an introverted feeling authenticity person. Right. Anyway, that's an example of some of the I would say external world attempt to get into the inner space of a human.
Yep. Yeah. There's plots of land in there and people are always on a hunt for it.
Yeah.
What do they call it? Mental real estate. So there is mental real estate. And yes, other people are always trying to get in there and try to occupy our internal landscape.
Yeah.
That said, when we
screw
talk
those
about
guys.
Yeah.
Just kidding. I know there's need for it in some ways.
Well, it's not just need. I would argue that while the inner space feels like a Wild West, where there are no outer rules that are imposed upon it, there is something to be said for having a disciplined inner terrain. So it's not that it shouldn't have rules. It's that when there are rules applied to our inner space, it is in our best interest to make sure that they are ours, right? That there are rules, that we're not handing that power over to other people willy-nilly.
Yeah.
So there is something to be said for the inner world being a world of processing, and that includes that includes which things are we going to process and which things are we not. And then when you look at it through the lens of functions or cognitive functions and type, and how we all have preferred functions, it shows us which forms of processing that we take to, that we're skilled in, that we're going to be paying attention to more, and which forms of processing that is going to feel outside of our reach. And then the same is true in the opposite, which is the outer world of living, right? We're all going to live life in certain ways, right? That's why we show up differently, right? We have different interests, we have different skills, we have different talents, we have different elements that draw our attention. And when you look at it through the lens of these functions, it's like, well, what life is left on the table that we're not grabbing? Because we're not pre-wired to think of that as part of living. So I'd like to go into the 4 extroverted elements of these functions, right? So if you take the 4 functions of sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, and break them down into these 4 these 8 different ways of seeing them, the 4 ways that we live these functions and the 4 ways that we process these functions, they have different qualities and characteristics, and yet each one is needed. And I find it really interesting that there's a symmetry here. If a person were to ask what's more important, to live life or to process life, I'd say if this theory is accurate and true, it's fascinating that our brain has given us a capacity to do each of them in equal measure.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's if you look at it just in terms of symmetry, living life is just as important as processing life.
Yes.
And processing life is just as important as living life.
But we do have a proclivity to one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes us human. That's what dictates our personality. We have capacity for both, but we have more interest and maybe determination to do one over the other.
Right, which is, I mean, one could argue is the difference between an introvert and an extrovert. An introvert is somebody who most favors a processing form of life, right? They prefer to process. And an extrovert is somebody who prefers to live. And then if you look at it one layer further into the specific function, right? Because every personality type has what's called a dominant cognitive function, or we call it a driver in the car model. Then that is their preferred way to process or their preferred way to live.
Yes.
So yeah, it's like, do you prefer to process or do you prefer to live? And the reason why both of them are so important and have such beautiful symmetry is if you prefer to process at a certain point, you run out of lived material.
Yeah.
You have to go live a little bit more in order to have more like new ground to process.
Well, you don't have to. You just get real weird.
Yeah. Right.
You're like,
real insular.
you got all these weird abstract ideas and home with your cats on the internet. You're like, that guy's got off the rails pretty hardcore.
Well, what happens is you get so used to the territory you've already covered, you start to lose a sense of efficacy of being able to process new material.
Yeah.
That's what the fear of living is, the fear of not being able to process what you've lived.
And to be fair, people on the other side that do all the living and don't slow down to process also get weird.
Yes.
Right. It's not like it's just the person at home by themselves. It's also the person out there constantly in the motion.
Right.
One-sided, one note. Yeah. I mean, it's just as weird, just in a different way.
Well, what happens is if you have a preference for living and you don't process, you've got a bunch of backlog material. And the way that it shows up, quote unquote, weird is that you don't understand how this unprocessed material is it's impacting your behavior. So it shows up in all sorts of crazy ways, right? It's like you turn out to be somebody who does a lot of, I think what ends up happening is you do a lot of apologizing.
Yeah.
Right. You have to apologize and say, sorry, that wasn't me. And it's like, no, that was you. It's just based on your unprocessed material.
So I know you said that we were going to tune into the extroverted functions, but we can also do the introvert at the same time. We could just take one of the top level. Let's start with sensing. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's just start with sensing as itself. So again, sensing has two different attitudes. Introverted sensing, we call it memory. Extroverted sensing, we call it sensation. And there's some qualitative difference, but both are rooted in sensing, right? One's just more internal processing and one's more living of sensing. Let's get more nuance around this. What does it mean to process sensing versus live sensing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one to start with. So sensing is another word to explain sensing is experiencing.
Yeah.
Right. When you're tuned into the sensory environment around you, or when you are processing the sensory experience around you, you're tuned into something that has occurred. You're attuned to something that has actually happened, and you were there to witness it.
Existence.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
Meaning, to contrast that, just to make sure we land this, against intuition, which you can imagine something that hasn't been or will never be.
That's right.
But sensing is tied to things that have been or are.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Yeah, exactly. The things that you can interact with using the instrument of the human body.
Yeah.
So what it means to live sensing or to extrovert it, right? Extroverted sensing means to be present in an experience in the here and now. Now, this is tied to time, right? It's living sensing. It's living an experience. So it's tied to something on the timeline. And since it is about like just tuning into what is, the only thing we can be 100% sure is reality is the present moment, right?
Yeah.
The past doesn't actually exist and the future doesn't actually exist in terms of our five senses. Right?
They're just abstractions.
They're just abstractions. That's right. And so when you are living sensing, it means that you are tuned into the moment, into the environment, into the experience of the here and now.
So it's not just a matter of doing the thing. It's about paying attention to doing the thing is what I'm hearing you say. So I have this experience, probably somebody listening or watching has experience. You get in the car to go do something very common, like go to the grocery store or go somewhere to pick up something that you do once or twice a week. You get in the car, next thing you know, you're standing at the door of the grocery store and you have this thought like, I don't remember getting here. I don't remember driving here. I don't remember going through the stoplights. I don't remember turning. I just all of a sudden became aware that I'm standing in the store. Now I got to think about what did I need again? And you tune back into the moment. Now, I don't know if that's a universal experience. I think it's probably pretty universal. I've definitely had that experience. My guess is a lot of people listening. Have you, Antonia, just to tune in?
Yeah, I think everybody's had that
Okay.
experience, but I think some personality types are
More
likely to have it more often than others.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So would that be living the experience? Because technically I did the thing.
Yeah.
But I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah. No.
So just give me some qualitative understanding here about what you mean by living it.
Yeah. You had an experience, but you weren't tuned into it. So it was kind of almost meaningless. You were tuned into another energy. When it comes to extroverted sensing, what we call sensation, it's being tuned into the experience. It's living an experience, right? It's being in the energetic field of an experience.
Feeling my hands on the wheel, watching the stoplights, talking to the person I'm with, or listening to the radio. Whatever I'm doing, I'm being very present to all the things happening.
Right. And as about 4 billion different mindfulness journals will tell you, that's one of the ways that we tune into the richness of life is by being present. And so that's one of the reasons why feeling a sense of aliveness and feeling joie de vivre is associated with this function, because it's not getting lost in its own thoughts. It's not being divorced from what's going on in your own life.
Yeah.
It is being present to your life. It's being present to your experience. And then if you're wired to have this as something that is, like a strength for you, you could see why one would build an appetite for experiences, right? They would be so tuned into an experience. They would want more of them, and they would want them to have more variety, and they would want them to be more textured. They would want them to be exciting or interesting or rich or immersive. This is the function that reminds us of the beauty of just living.
Yeah.
Right.
So taking this idea then, this idea of fully living, there was an ISFP friend of ours. I can't remember, or excuse me, ISFJ friend of ours, who leads with the other sensing attitude, introverted sensing or memory. And she was telling us about this experience that she took her kids to a playground, and she said she was engaged and present in the moment, watching her children play. They did a couple dangerous things, or climbing the monkey bars, and it was like, I hope they're okay, kind of in the moment. And everything was fine. They left the playground, and she said the moment she started to think about the experience that she just had, then she started to panic. After the trauma or the possible things that could go down or go wrong, she started to get a little anxious about, oh my goodness, my kids could have really hurt themselves. They could have fallen off of that. Like, maybe that was unsafe what I just put my children in the place of. And I think in here, we're already seeing now, after an experience happens, somebody that is processing what happened to think about like what it meant or all the things that could have happened, or really tuning into the post-processing of something that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just introducing this just for pacing reasons. You can still go back and we can add more extroversion flavors to this, but I'm just trying to inject both of these so we can talk about them in tandem now.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Back and forth.
Right. So what you're talking about is introverted sensing or processing an experience.
Yes.
Right? And processing always gives us implication. It always gives us personal meaning.
Yes.
It gives us an ability to add a flavor to it that is distinct in our own. So introverted sensing isn't having an experience, it's processing an experience.
The implications of that experience it's ruminating on.
Yeah, right. It's like what happened, and what is my memory of what happened, and what were the things that struck me about what happened.
Yes.
And what is that all like? What does that mean for me, and what does that mean for the situation, or for society at large, or whatever.
And that's why we call this function memory, not because the person has a good memory, although they might. It's about reviewing memories to understand what happened and to process through those sensory experiences.
Now, what's interesting about introverted sensing is that an experience can be processed that you did not personally have.
Yes.
So you can process other people's experiences and still come away with implication or meaning. And you can see this in biographies, or in hearing somebody else's story, or benefiting from their expertise. If an individual has done quite a bit of study on a topic and you'd like the benefit of that, well, you can process their experiences and understand sort of like the connection, or how, like understanding what that means in terms of maybe a project you're working on, or the information you're trying to gather.
Rituals do this.
Mm-hmm.
Like the ritual, for example, in church I grew up with, the body and the blood of Christ kind of communion. is harkening back to a real meal that happened ostensibly with Jesus and his disciples, and you're processing what happened by going through this ritual as a communal group, congregation, to experience it collectively, to process that.
Right.
And that's an introverted sensing memory moment, I think.
You got it. And that's why this is a function that tends to be tied to things like traditions and rituals,
holidays,
and history.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because you are, while you're using this function, you're stewarding, processing something that wasn't maybe personal to you, but you're still carrying it forward, right? Like you're a holder of processing this experience, even if it wasn't originally your experience. So one of the big differences between extroverted sensing and introverted sensing is that extroverted sensing, it's you, it's the experience you're having. Introverted sensing, in a processing way, could be somebody else's experience, right? For
Yes.
the time. So, how do you know? How do you know that you are doing extroverted sensing, right? What are the markers of extroverted sensing? The markers of extroverted sensing is a sense of aliveness, as mentioned before. It's a sense of joie de vivre. It's a sense of presence to your own life, that you're not leaving money on the table of having a, like recognizing what's going on around you as it's happening. Otherwise, 10 years goes by and you're like, I don't even remember the last 10 years. It feels like it was 2 years.
I never remember driving to the grocery store.
Right.
Not once.
Right.
I have no memory of it. It's just there every other day. I don't know how I got there.
And if you have a lot of those, and it's more than just, driving to the grocery store, if it's the moments you're spending with your children, or the moments you're spending with your partner, or all the things about life that are like the truly rich, rewarding elements.
Yeah.
If you're not present with them, then you're missing out. You're not truly doing extroverted sensing. You're not truly living your sensing or having an experience. But on the flip side, how do you know when you've fully done introverted sensing? How do you know when you've fully processed sensing?
It's a little tougher.
Mm-hmm.
There's some measurement to this.
Right.
And it's hard to know because it's an internal process.
Yeah, exactly. It's like subjective. It's going on in the inner landscape. So my suspicion is that when you have fully processed an experience, because the result is resolution, right? And I before was playing with this idea of peace of mind, or maybe a sense of acceptance. But acceptance can be passive. When you truly process something through, you have like it requires some thought labor. It requires you doing some work. It requires you not just reviewing a thing, but it requires you to understand its connection to everything else, or its implication for you. It requires you to, to not turn away from it if it was a difficult experience, or to not get caught up in it and have it be on loop all the time and not be able to, to overcome it. Like it takes some effort to truly process an experience, particularly one that's tough. So when you get to the other side of a fully processed experience, yes, I think you do end up with peace of mind. I think you do end up with acceptance, but I think you end up with resolution. I think it is resolved in your mind that you understand what it meant to you and you feel a sense of completion over it.
You probably can feel that resolution and completion without feeling a peace of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that is, and I don't know if this pattern matches here, so I may not know enough about what I'm talking about for it to land, but I think I might be onto something. When the UN passes something, they call it a UN resolution. Like literally, like they come together, they ruminate on something, and they make a decision or kind of like process through it. And they're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And they pass a UN resolution. That's what this makes me think of. It's almost like, and it may not be peaceful or good, or like you think a positive thing of it. It's just a statement of like, this is collectively, we've processed through, and this is kind of where we've come down on something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really to the self. I'm like, I can't always assume it's going to be a positive experience afterward. It's just my resolution. It's been resolved in a way.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's got a conclusion to it. It feels resolved. Even if the resolution isn't always happy or positive, mm-hmm. at least it's come to that completion point.
Yes.
I think that's what we can expect of it.
Right. Yeah. It's like acceptance, but it's not passive.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the marker is you are neither ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen, or kicking the can down the road, or like putting up blinders to its existence inside, right? Like you're actually, because it's taking up mental real estate. And oftentimes these unprocessed experiences are just waiting for us to pay attention to them. So you're neither kicking the can down the road, nor are you completely caught up in it. it's like now something that's a broken record that you can't get away from. So it's not something you're neglecting and ignoring, and it's not something you're overvaluing.
Yeah. Okay. So any more distinction on this? Because I do want to hit these others in a pretty, not rapid clip, but keep going. So I just want to make sure we honor anything else you wanted to inject here. It's coming up.
No, I feel complete on that one.
Yeah.
But it's like, so you can see how the lived part versus the processed part takes the same function, sensing, and divides it into two very distinctive flavors. And you can see how there would be some crossover. Like it would feel like you said, our friend went to a park. She was in the experience. Very quickly afterwards, she ruminated on the experience, and that made her nervous. So it's like they happened in such rapid succession. It's like, which sensing function was I using? But it's like, well, which one was the lived version that you were having yourself as an experience, and which one was the process of the lived experience?
So let's flip it over to the other perceiving side. So we talked about sensing. We talked about introverted sensing memory, extroverted sensing sensation. Let's talk about intuition, the other perceiving function set. So introverted intuition we call perspectives. Extroverted intuition we call exploration. And again, we talk about all the qualities of these in our owner's manuals for your personality type and also on our website. So you can go look up information, but let's talk about intuition at its most radical nucleus, fundamental form.
Yeah.
It's about imagination and speculation and pattern recognition.
Right. Yeah. Intuition as a function in and of itself is, it's perceiving. So it's taking in information, and it's doing so based on what isn't coming in through your senses. So how do you perceive something that you are not directly experiencing? You do so by, like you mentioned, patterning, right? Like connecting the dots. A lot of times we call it behind the curtain thinking. It requires some information in front of the curtain or some sensory information to come at you in order to speculate what's going on behind the curtain. But by definition, you can never directly see what's behind a curtain. You have to make an intuitive leap. You have to speculate. So intuition is about imagining what's going on behind the curtain. It's about perceiving things with your mind's eye as opposed to your senses.
Yeah.
So if intuition is, if we're going to apply the same rule of the extroverted side being living it and the introverted side being processing it, that rule would apply to both extroverted intuition and introverted intuition.
Yeah.
So extroverted intuition, we call it exploration. It's about living intuition. So how does one live intuition? Well, you do so by coming up with ideas and speculations and imaginings in the moment, in real time, right? You're engaging with the timeline outside of yourself. You're engaging with reality. You're engaging with other people. And oftentimes this looks like using the outside world to fuel more of these speculations. So the easiest example would be brainstorming. You're having a conversation with somebody. You're coming up with, ideas or concepts, new ideas and concepts. They come up with new ideas and concepts. You start cross-pollinating each other's ideas and concepts, and now you've got an even newer one, right? It's living it by expressing it out loud. Now, it's very different than experiencing, right? Because you're caught up in something that by definition isn't around you, right? But you're still living through it. So a part of how that looks for people who favor this function is, I kind of think of it, I call it laying train tracks in front of the train while it's in motion.
Yeah.
And you can see this a lot of times in people who trust that the next word is going to show up for them. They start talking and they're not sure how they're going to end the sentence, and they're not 100% sure what the sentence even means until they get to hear themselves say it. And then they go, oh, yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
So it's living it. It's taking intuition and imaginings and speculation and patterning, and it's moving through the world with this as your guide.
Yeah.
Right?
How I like to look at it is it's almost like manipulating and laboratorying, if that's even a word, with meanings. Like I'm going, what if this combined with this? What would the new emergent of that be? And what would it mean? And how would it play into something bigger or different? Or in a brainstorming, it's like, oh yeah, if we took the meaning of that word and you had the idea of combining with the meaning of this word, we can create a new meaning out of it right now just to play with the concept, just to see if it takes.
Mhm.
And we do it. And it's like a dumb new meaning. I'm like, that doesn't work. Okay, well, let's try this one. It's like we're looking for a playful, lived experience of meaning
Yeah.
and meaning making in real time.
Like rapid prototyping.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that's I mean, you and I both use this as our driver function, exploration,
Mhm.
extrovert intuition. So this is the world we live in and swim in. It's so ubiquitous in my life that, we paint our walls in our studio and our office whiteboard paint, and we got whiteboards all over the house because we're always throwing ideas out and we're testing ideas. Some of the people in our lives are always like, you guys are always changing things all the time. No, we're experimenting. We're trying to find the best way forward. We're trying to find what means the best way to go forward. Like,
Yeah.
I'm always looking for that. I'm experimenting with it playfully.
And it feels like tangents
Yeah.
to other people because you're playing with this idea. Like you're starting a sentence and it takes you where it wants to go. So when you're talking, one of the pieces of feedback I get on a regular basis that always surprises me is when I'm talking to somebody and they tell me that I'm shifting topics a lot. And I'm always like, no, I'm not. Because to me, it's all one topic, right? It's all connected. And so living intuition means giving yourself permission to explore, quote unquote, explore topics. And you can do that either verbally through a conversation, or you could do that through research, or you can do that through living life, right? And having some of these quote unquote experiences. But the experiences are not just to feel a sense of aliveness; they're to make connections with missing pieces of information.
Yeah.
Right? It's like I love to travel just as much as SPs do. Right? I've noticed that perceivers, we NPs and SPs are the ones who, if they get the travel bug, they tend not to stop. Right? They just have to keep traveling to more and more exotic locations. But I find that my motivation and their motivation is very different.
Yeah.
And their motivation is to have had the experience. My motivation is to make connections about things that I don't feel like I can do simply through research.
Yes.
So they're very similar, but they have two different motivations or intentions behind them.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges I have with exploration, because I lead with this function, is it feels like as I'm living that intuition, I'm patterning in the outer world. And you tell me if you use this function as a strength, if you identify with this. It feels like it's hard to lock down on a direction or the right answer. Because every time I come up with an idea, and especially if other people are involved, I'm brainstorming, I'm coming with all these creative possibilities. Every new combination of possibility opens up even more distraction and possibility combinations. Like, it's not like one idea. It's like, oh, that's great. Finally, we can do that. And it goes down into what we're going to do. It actually goes, oh, well, that gives me this idea. And the person says, but that gives me this idea. So it feels ever expansive when I'm living it. And it's really hard to know, well, what is the purposeful direction that all this meaning could be made from? It just kind of feels a little bit chaotic sometimes. Now, you and I counter that with other functions in our personality to help us find our way forward. But sometimes if you just leaned on intuition itself in the extroverted way, I don't know if it really gets clarity of what to do or where to head. Right. So we can talk about the introverted intuitive function, introverted intuition.
Yeah.
We call it perspectives. It's not just about shifting perspectives into other people's viewpoints. It's also about taking a meta perspective in meaning and ruminating on all the perspectives top down.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit different than that real-time exploration type of intuition.
Yeah. So as opposed to living intuition, it's processing intuition.
That's right.
And processing means taking the time to imagine inside of yourself. So the possibilities in the outside world that extroverted intuition encourages, which is try this, throw spaghetti against this wall, like attempt this, make a rapid prototype around this. What would happen if we did this, right? It's all possibilities thinking. When you bring it inside and you do world building inside of yourself, which is what processing intuition usually leads to. It usually leads to a form of world building.
Simulation.
That's right. Simulating. You create a simulation, and because you're now replicating what it would be like to live through it, but without having to be responsive to the outside world. Again, there's no time pressure here. There's no responsiveness or reactiveness. When you're living life, you're responding to the outside world, and that outside world gives you limitations. when you bring all of this insight and start processing it, there's no limitations in here. You can build whatever world you want to, and you can run whatever simulation you want to, and there's no time pressure.
As long as you want to.
As long as you want to. That's right.
Some INJs do.
That's right. And so what ends up happening is there's sufficient time to not just consider possibilities, but there's sufficient time to consider probabilities, to live, like to simulate what it would be like to live through these possibilities. And when you do that, now you come up with an idea of, well, that possibility is probably not going to pan out. That possibility is probably not going to work. That possibility is probably going to lead to things that I don't want. But if I keep narrowing these possibilities down and running a simulation of each of one of them, I run into a probability.
Yeah.
I run into something that's most likely to happen, and or will lead to the implications I desire. Right? If I go this direction, this is what it will look like. If I go this direction, this is what it will look like.
Yes.
And that world building extends into shifting to other people's perspectives as well, right? It's like, what is the world from that person's set of eyes? What's the world from that person's set of eyes?
Yeah.
And so when intuition is processed, then it ends up allowing an individual to not simply be responsive to stimuli that's coming in, but it allows an individual to shape that stimuli, to give them a way to sort of navigate around some of these challenges that is not as reactive. It's not as real time. It's more of a measured approach.
So the first image that popped up in my head as you were talking about this is the image of like a large oak tree with all these branches that go down to their infinite ends. And almost like if extrovert intuition created this explosion in this giant tree that grew in all these different limbs and branches of possibility. My first thought was, as you were talking, well, introverted intuition perspectives is more like the pruning shears that prunes off all of those and then finds more of like, well, this is probably the branch it's going to go down. This is the probability. But as I thought about it, I thought, well, actually pruning shears are more of a judging. It's more decisive. It's like cutting something off. That would be more like introverted thinking or introverted feeling, or extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, something where it's making a decision about what to do. There's something though with all the possibilities. It is like a pruning nature for introverted intuition, but it's not necessarily pruning it in a way it's like severely cutting off that as a channel. It's just refining the clarity of the probability. It still sees the entire picture. It doesn't decide we're not going to go down that channel. It just says probably it wouldn't work to go down that channel. That's where the judging functions come in to decide what we're going to do.
Right.
But the intuition just helps get more clarity around those branches are probably going to die someday. Those branches there are going to lead to bad stuff. Those branches there aren't going to be strong enough to support. In other words, it can almost simulate prejudgment some of the probabilities. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think of it more like which roads end.
Yeah.
Right. Like if I'm
Dead
standing,
ends.
if I'm standing at a center of all these different roads of what could happen. And if I'm able to simulate living through them or take a meta perspective over the top, right, and to be able to see an aerial view, I see which roads dead end, and then I see which road doesn't dead end. And so it has nothing to do with my personal desires necessarily.
Exactly.
Although my desires might color which roads I want to end. But when you're living intuition with extroverted intuition, you're waiting for the world to tell you how it's responding to your intuition. So you might be able to, it's almost like you're being guided in the outside world with instinct, right? There's like there's a sense of, I can't make predictions because the world is telling me very quickly how it's going to respond to me. And so I'm simply responding to its response to me. Whereas when it's introverted intuition, you don't have to deal with any of that, right? You get to just sort of world build and see these roads and take your time. So with the same question with the sensing is, how do you know you're doing this thing with the marker?
Yeah. So the question would be, if introverted intuition perspectives is about processing, imagination, patterning, intuition, how do I know I've processed my intuition? How do I know what's the measurement at the end of that road to say, oh, I actually processed through this?
Right. Well, let's start with the easy one, which is extroverted intuition. How do I know I'm doing that? Because it's easier to observe, right, from the outside world. Extroverted intuition, you know you're doing it well because you have a sense of hope. You have a sense of possibilities in your world. You have an ability to see connections. and to rely on your ability to navigate through something that you don't necessarily have a guide for. So so there's a sense of like there's a faith to it, and there's a sense of optimism and hopefulness. Um, there's an almost like a effervescence to it. I think of it as the carbonated function. So you know you're doing this function well when you have not just a faith in yourself to be able to get through anything. Extroverted sensing has that, right? It's like, well, if I get myself in a terrible situation, I trust I'll be able to get myself back out. Extroverted intuition has that too, but it's more about like a optimism that it's all going to work out. Like
Yeah.
it's going to be okay. Right.
Yeah.
And that's that faith, the faith that the next word will show up, the faith that the train track will lay faster than the train will run over it.
Well, and this would show up in like in our work, for example, working with a client or we're doing something and you call this channeling. I would agree with you. It's almost the extroverted intuition sees all the material around it. And it starts to get in this like vibe and it starts to just generate and connect and it's almost like magic. It almost feels like it's happening to you as the user.
Yeah.
Like as somebody that wields this function, this is my driver. I'm not in control anymore. I'm allowing the intuition to come through me.
Yeah.
And so it's very short range and it's like in real time. And it's hard to get there in that space.
Yeah.
But when I'm there, that feels really good to be present to that. Now, again, I have this as a strength. Somebody that doesn't have this as a strength, it's way down there in all their cognitive functions. They may not experience it the way I'm experiencing it.
Yeah.
It might be more of what you're talking about, that hope.
Yeah.
Where at the end, it may not be an emotion. It might just be a sense of like, no, there's something that can be figured out here.
I think with all the extroverted functions, when they're preferred, like as a driver or a co-pilot, channeling is available. I think extroverted sensing, when, you see somebody who has just like mastery over their body, like a dancer or performer, or
they're not thinking about it. They're just doing it.
That's right. They're channeling an energy that their body is responding to, and they're not even sure what's going on.
You almost have to, like those guys in the X Games that do like backflips and spins on a bike.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be thinking about that.
Right.
You're just doing it. You're channeling the experience of it.
That's right. Yeah. And does every SP do that? No, of course not. But I think in order to be able to channel on that level with extroverted sensing, I think it has to be a preferred function to get to that level where it's almost like divine energy is imbued inside of you. And extroverted intuition it's allows for a knowingness. Once you're in the energetic space of something, there's like a knowingness. Like I know what to do. I know what's going on. I know things that I shouldn't know. But I have to be in the energy of it.
Yeah.
I have to be there in the moment. And NPs have access to this form of channeling.
Yeah. So that knowingness leads to peace or hope often.
Yeah. Well, a faith.
Faith.
Right? A faith that the information will be given to me as I need it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that comes from doing it enough to see it happen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think if I had the experience of laying the tracks as I talk, even in these podcasts, I don't always know what I'm going to say. But as I watch it, oh, okay, yeah, that made sense. That connected.
Yep.
And then I do that enough. I'm like, okay, I can rest into that.
Yep.
I can trust that process.
Yeah. And actually, I would say that it's much easier to do that than to go by notes.
Yeah.
Right. Like when I go by notes, it's like stilted. It's much more difficult. If I'm just riffing off the top of my head, it's a much easier process. And so flipping to the other side, which is introverted intuition, how do you know you've processed intuition? Well, and I want to make a note about this because sensing, thinking, and feeling all come in here as well. But you know that you have processed your intuition because you get that thing that you mentioned before that you lack as somebody who uses extroverted intuition, and that is direction. If you have fully processed introverted intuition, it gives you direction. Now, a person could think that processing introverted intuition will give you insight or an epiphany. But I suspect that insights and epiphanies are at the beginning of the process. Just like a memory or something that comes up for you, like something that almost imposes itself on your mind, is the beginning of introverted sensing. A memory comes up, or a concept of what has been from the past, or some historical context. It comes up, an awareness of something that has been, and then fully processing it is getting to the other side and having resolution. An insight, an epiphany, an aha is the beginning of introverted intuition. It's giving you an insight. It's giving you an aha. But to fully process it, which means to really ruminate on it and think about it and take it to its conclusion and do the thought labor of, running simulations and figuring it out, when you get to the other side of that, now you have direction. Now you know which of those roads don't lead to dead ends. Which of the perspectives and world building by jumping into other people's worlds, which one is the right direction to see it from, or is the best one, or the most the one with the most utility.
Yeah.
So there is a sense of direction that comes from fully processing introverted intuition. It's a knowingness that goes beyond just knowing. It actually gives you it gives you trajectory.
Yeah. Okay. So we talk about this all the time. An INTJ, let's say, sits down on a romantic date with somebody and they have that flash of insight like, oh, I'm not going to be with this person long term. And we've always said to INJs, sometimes you cut yourself off from opportunities because you have that flash of insight in that moment. And you go, okay, I just got to get out of this date as fast as I can because I don't have the sense that I'm going to be with this person long term. And I would argue that if I talk to an INTJ, let's just say, that had that experience, they'd say, no, I processed and that gave me a sense of direction. Don't pursue this relationship. That was the sense of direction in that moment that I had the flash of. Mm-hmm. Are we suggesting that that is not to be relied upon and they should pursue and process through that intuition further, like go further into that in some way?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm begging the question. I think that's what we're suggesting.
Well, I would say it gave them an impulse, but I don't know if it gave them direction. Okay. This is more like direction of life or direction of using the insight. I wouldn't say that if I get an insight that I'm not going to be with this person long term and I get up and leave, I wouldn't exactly say I had direction in my life.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Fair enough.
It was like, I just had an impulse to get up and walk out. And oftentimes what they're doing in that moment, and the reason why we say try not to do that as much, is because they're actually robbing themselves of an extroverted sensing experience.
Yeah.
And again, as mentioned, if you don't have enough experiences, you don't have enough to process, and you're covering the same territory over and over and over again. And that will create limitations.
Yeah.
It'll create limitations of being able to process new experiences. So you want to they're both equally important. So if you go, I'm not going to be with this person long term, but I'm going to enjoy the experience.
Yeah.
That's a very healthy way of doing it, because later, like, something might surprise you. And I don't mean surprise you like, oh, I was wrong, I want to spend the rest of my life with this person.
Yes.
But something might surprise you that you later take home for a learning, something that you can plug into processing later to go, I learned something about myself, or I learned something about the world that I wasn't expecting.
Yes. Okay. And then just to land this again, because I think this is something, especially intuition, because it is abstract and some esoteric nature to it. I just wanted to make sure I land a couple practical examples here. I contend with this idea all the time. I think you and I do in our company, Antonia. We sit down to solve a problem, let's say. There's like a program that we need to promote or have, some calibration to. And we'll start to talk about ideas because we're looking for direction of what to do. We're trying to make a good decision, get direction and clarity. By the time we come out of a meeting or a conversation, we'll have like 10 more ideas on top of the original idea.
Yep.
And I feel even less of a direction, right? I feel like, oh, well, now there's 10 ways we could go, right? Yep. And I really appreciate the NJs on our team or in our lives that use this perspectives process high up, because often they can look at things. Now they need more time. They can't necessarily do it in one meeting. I have to tell them and I go, put in your NI and smoke it, and then come back and tell me later. But they'll often come back and say, look, I've been thinking about it. I think this direction here is going to be the best one for us. You can cut out those other 5 on the other sides and just go down this road. I think this is going to be the best way. Now, I may not always agree, but I appreciate that thinking, because again, the solution for me is just more is more. Mm-hmm. But I think the perspectives process, introverted intuition, helps us understand, like, sometimes less is more. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's what we're going to say no to for the direction of our life. So It's a very important, both of the intuitive attitudes balance each other out in a way. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, you have this extroverted sensing experience being on the date, but also that INTJ could say, well, it's also my extroverted intuition, the extroverted attitude side of my intuition. Right now, I'm just trusting the direction part of me, or not direction, but it's, or you disagree with that idea of its direction, but I'm going to trust the instinct I have for the long-term viability of this. But what you're robbing yourself of is the possibility of something you hadn't considered, a disruptive pattern or connection. Like, right. Well, wait, maybe this could work with this person long-term. I didn't even consider this other possibility. And so I think intuition needs the other side. Mm-hmm. If you're wired to be paying attention to the introverted version or attitude of that, you can benefit so much from the extroverted and vice versa.
Yeah. Or maybe the person you're on a date with, you both mutually go, yeah, this is not going to work out. And then they like introduce you to their roommate at the end of the night.
There you go.
And you're like, oh, this is why I was on this date or whatever. You know, it's like there's
Exactly.
always, that's the thing about extroverted intuition is it's always up for, you know, possibilities.
You never know.
You never know.
Okay. So this idea of so we've been talking about living the extroverted functions or attitudes of a function and processing the inner space or processing with the introverted versions of those. We talked about sensing, and we talked about the extroverted sensing, the attitude of extroversion with sensing, introverted sensing, sensation and memory, perceiving function. Then we just talked about intuition, extroverted intuition, introverted intuition, perspectives or exploration and perspectives.
Yeah. And one thing I'd like to mention about intuition is, or introverted intuition is processing this function also helps us tune into things like archetypes.
Yeah.
And archetypes are extremely important for us to tune into because it helps us be what Jean Shanita Boleyn calls choice makers. So when we are influenced by the outside world to take certain actions, and we are unfamiliar with the idea of archetypes, meaning that we don't know that there's different flavors of humans. I mean, that's basically what type is. Personality types is an archetypal system that says there's 16 different ways of going about living reality. And so part of how processing intuition serves us and why we must process it is it helps us understand that we can tune into archetypal energy that helps us make choices that are right for us. Not just choices that are probable, but choices that are also more in our lane, more about how we show up. And so we can make healthier choices later when we're using, like, say, our decision-making functions.
So just to land that in a real practical, tangible way, let's say I identify the archetype of like a warrior. As I'm running these simulations and trying to think about probabilities, and I'm processing my intuition to assume, like, to find the pathway or the direction, what you're saying is I'm also going to be using the inner processing of those archetypes. I'm going to tune to that. I'm going to compare and contrast, not just on what would play out into the future or probabilities, but I'm also going to compare and contrast it with my personal meaning of the archetypes I associate, whether conscious or unconscious. I might have the unconscious or conscious associated with the warrior archetype, let's say. I'm going to compare and contrast against that. I definitely see myself as the father archetype. I literally have children. So I tune into the father archetype all the time. So as I run a simulation of something, I'm going to take that into account because that's a personal meaning to me, archetypically.
Right. Yep.
That's what you're saying, is it's going to have other qualitative things that baked into the processing of that intuition.
Yeah.
Besides just simulation.
Right. Exactly. It helps us tap into personal meaning.
Yeah.
And it helps us kind of understand how to sort ourselves.
Yeah.
In choices that we make. Exactly. I have a recommendation.
Okay.
Okay. So this one's I can tell this has already gone long.
Yes.
So I have actually quite a bit more information even after we go through these functions as usual. So I suggest we make this a two-parter.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll just stop here with the two perceiving nucleus, radical expressions of, well, 4 functions, but 2 perceiving: sensing, intuition, and then expressed, extrovert, introvert. So we got 4 functions out of the gate. The perceiving functions. Next time we'll talk about the 4 judging functions. Right. And their radical nature or fundamental nature.
That's right. But just to conclude this particular episode before we go to part 2, the theory is that the extroverted expressions are the lived expressions, and the introverted expressions are the processing expressions.
I hate the word theory. Can we change it to something else? Like the idea or the positing thought? The
concepts?
Because the reason I don't like theory is we actually are going to be testing this with our actual coaching clients over the next several months. And it will not be theory very soon. We're going to put this into practice to see if it holds up in real life. And so the reason I don't like that word is we're anchoring this now for something that I'm pretty sure works out and bears out with real people. And so people go, oh, that's just a theory they had. It's probably going to be much more than a theory going forward.
I'll just say this. I can't unsee it.
Yes.
So if the whole thing is a theory. All of this is a theory.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a narrative. It's a theory. I get all that.
It's just a way of experiencing reality or seeing it or,
I'm just saying
organizing it.
I think it's a framework, and I think we're going to apply it in real ways.
Framework is a good way of saying
I like
it.
that better.
Yeah.
I know it's haggling over detail, but again,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think in terms of how we shape the conversation of all of this,
Right.
because I really want to land real stuff for real people.
So I'll just say it's a framework I can't unsee.
There you go.
And so based on, again, the point of origin, which was if you're having trouble defining a function,
Yeah.
ask yourself, is this expression, is this behavior, is the thing or the result of this thing? Is it because I was living it? Am I actively living it and engaging with the outside world and influencing reality, and reality is influencing me, right? Is it a lived expression, or is it the result of processing? And the markers of processing, completely processing, are different. So if you are a person who, say, avoids ruminating on the past or is trapped by an experience of the past, you probably have processing you need to do in your sensing. You have introverted sensing processing that is waiting for you to do. And if you don't do that processing, if you don't get to the point of resolution or the more active version of acceptance, but acceptance is a big piece of that. If you don't get to that place, it's going to occupy mental real estate until you do. Right? So you don't have to be somebody with SJ or even NP preferences to do this work. You just need to be a person who understands that this is important. If you are a person who doesn't have direction, right? You're lacking direction that's built on meaning, then you probably have some introverted intuition processing you need to do. And it doesn't mean you have to be an NJ or even an SP type. It just means that it's waiting for you to process it. You have some imagination, you have some intuition, some patterning that's waiting for you to look at it and try to run simulations into the future. Now, depending on your personality type, both of those activities can be very uncomfortable, right? There's a lot of people who don't like to look at the past, and there's a lot of people who are very disconcerted by looking into the future or trying to determine the meaning of their life. Totally understandable. And yet they're sitting there, they're waiting for us to access them. We don't have to do it elegantly. As mentioned before with the extroverted functions, I think that depending upon our strengths, right, our personality type, people can channel with those functions, but I don't think it's available to everybody, right? Like I think you have to be an SP type to channel extroverted sensing. I think you have to be an NP type to channel extroverted intuition, but that doesn't mean you can't use those functions. So seeing markers of whether or not you're leaving money on the table, seeing markers of whether or not there's processing available, like that's waiting for you to look at it. I think this is helpful, not just in terms of identifying type or trying to define these terms, but also what am I missing in my life? Because I have to engage with all of these functions. I have to engage with a life that pulls on all these parts of myself. What's waiting for me to pay attention to it? And that's part of why it's hard for me to unsee this framework, because usually, like when we go through our personality life path program, that's oftentimes what's showing up is there's some work that needs to be done. There's something that the person needs to address and is waiting for them to address it in order to move on to the next, to the next lily pad in their journey.
Well, and I've noticed, there's a lot of material in the judging functions we're going to talk on the next episode. But with clients and students, the many cycles we've gone through in the life path mentorship so far, I would say that introverted sensing memory week is, I can say confidently, it's the most emotional of all of the 8 weeks we go through.
Yep.
We don't, as humans right now, have a good relationship with our past and processing it. And
Yes.
not just our personal past, but a lot of people come from, maybe they were children of immigrants, or they came to a country that in Europe or the United States or somewhere else that wasn't their country of origin. And they're bringing a lot of generational things with them that they almost feel responsibility. There's a bunch of material there in processing,
Yes.
both personal and writ large.
Yes.
And that's like what a lot of students or clients are dealing with. You have to get through something that once was to get to the other side. But the other 50% of students tend to struggle with direction and knowing what is right for my life.
Mm-hmm.
Like I got this message, I'm supposed to change the world maybe as a kid. That was the meaning projected onto me. I don't know if that's my personal meaning. Right. And they're questioning, like, but what am I here to do? I was told I was supposed to do all these things, but I don't necessarily know if that's what my meaning of life is. Now I feel confused and lost.
Yeah.
Can you help me find the through line, the meaning? And I would say that's the other half, is people that processing this introverted intuition of all the different meanings that were projected onto them and continually are projected onto us as humans, right?
Yep.
I think there's right now a battle of meaning in the world. Everybody's trying to say, no, that event meant this. No, it's like spin. No, that didn't mean that. That meant this.
Yeah.
And it stacks and stacks and stacks, and people aren't processing it. And then we're just slinging meaning back. We're like weaponizing meaning back and forth to each other.
We have a surprising amount of propaganda that tells us to not do sufficient work in our functions.
Yeah.
There's a couple functions that are approved of by society, but like take, for example, extroverted sensing. Most people are not encouraged to live.
Yeah.
Like to experience. Like they were told when they were young that that was dangerous, or that they're being too loud or enthusiastic, or we don't do that because it's not safe. I mean, safety is held against SP types in a way that kind of disturbs me.
Yeah.
I probably mentioned in the podcast before, but I hate a culture of safetyism. It's it's like one of my pet peeves. So, but safetyism encourages people to not do extroverted sensing, and I think it's terrible. I think you can tell that we're not doing sufficient introverted sensing because people can't resolve the past. Like if you hold the past by modern day standards, you are not resolving it, right? You're not accepting it for what it was at the time that it was. You're trying to apply some other meaning on top of it. And that's usually because individuals who can't resolve the past in a collective or community way, it's usually because they can't resolve the past in their own individual lives.
Yeah.
Like they need to do introverted sensing resolution work. And because they haven't done that yet, they project their challenge outward into the political sphere. So I think
they reframe it instead of accept it.
That's right. They reframe it.
They try to reframe.
Mm-hmm.
New meaning.
Mm-hmm.
When it's just like, just accept what happened. Process it fully.
That's right.
Have a resolution on the other side.
That's right.
Because you can't change what happened.
Yeah.
It happened.
Yeah, you have to accept it and resolve it. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the other piece of this framework that I can't unsee is it's like it kind of gives us a guidepost for what our work is.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then the other thing that's insidious about this is because they're introverted, the work can stack up for years or a lifetime and you never process it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to put conscious effort to this. You have to go, oh, wait, the external world is not necessarily ever going to put pressure on me. Like extroverted sensation, eventually I have to go to the bathroom. I have to eat. I have to get up out of my bed and walk to keep alive, to stay alive. But I don't necessarily have to process my inner sensing space to stay alive. Right? There's evolutionary pressure or societal pressure or something on the outer world that's going to get me to do extroverted living functions just by the nature of survival and reality.
Yeah.
But there is no evolutionary pressure on our inner functions.
Well, whatever pressure there is, it's 1 degree of separation removed.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the pressure is stop being an asshole.
Sure.
Right. Like that's the pressure. And it's like, well, how do I do that? It's like usually you have some processing. Right? If you're doing too much living, if you say have extroverted preferences and you're doing too much living, and you're not doing enough processing, then people are like, stop being a dick. And it's like, well, I don't know how to I don't know how to do that through living.
Yeah.
Right. Through continuing to experience. And it's like, oh, maybe I need to slow down and start processing my experiences.
There's this funny scene. You're rewatching the show Veronica Mars recently.
It's like my favorite.
It's like a go back to kind of thing from your younger years.
Yeah.
There's this scene where Veronica, I think it's like the movie or the 4th season. I was just on the background as I was doing something else.
Yeah.
And she's like at a bar, and this like dude who's in that like over extroverted, try to like appease her and figure out what's going on. He's like, all right, so what's your name? Where are you from? You have a boyfriend here? What does he make? I'm a hedge fund manager. I make way more than he does. I'm guarantee you. Like, where is he? I bet I do better than him. And he's like, just out. It's like, I'm like, that's a guy just to slow down and process some stuff, right? He's just like, he's like so in this, like trying to like connect with her and just interrupting himself to say the next thing.
Yes.
Because he can't slow down at all and have anything reflected to him, right? So he's just trying to control it all out here. It's like, that's a caricature, clearly.
Yeah.
But I've met people pretty close to that.
Yes.
In real life. Yeah. And so it's like, take a chill pill, man.
Yeah.
We all need a moment to come inside and process what's happening for us.
Yeah.
And people that are used to processing, there is a moment to also go and expand that as well. Yeah. Expand the territory.
Well, what happens is if you do too much processing, you don't do enough living, you get tunnel vision.
Yeah.
And so all the things that you're processing are just kind of a little off.
Yeah.
Right. They lack fidelity and sufficient texture.
Yep.
So there's a problem going both directions.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to pick this back up on the next episode, talk about the judging functions, the 4 judging functions, and then the 2 radical nucleuses of them. Fundamentals. I like the word radical. That'll be good in the title. Like people will click on that. Like radical. What's radical about this? That's the fundamental definition of the word. Okay, so we haven't heard from you yet. It's been myself and Antonia talking here on the video and the audio. You haven't had a microphone, but we do want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. What's coming up as you tune into, you're going to use all of these functions, but you're going to prefer one of these over all the others, right? You're going to pick one of these 4 perceiving functions as your primary way of perceiving your world. So what does that look like for you? Do you have a tendency, if you're in the extroverted attitude of that function, do you have a tendency just to act and be present in life to the detriment of processing? Or do you tend to process, if you're more on the introverted side, process all the time and sometimes you forget to live? Or do you have this balanced? Have you figured this out in your life? Do you have a good balance in your perceiving functions? You're able to live life and you're able to process those lived experiences. We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode.
And if you enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Please leave a rating and review on iTunes. Let's say, I'm going to paint a picture. You're a person who's been listening for, say, years. You haven't joined any of our programs. You haven't invested in any of the digital content, but that's okay because you're still gaining benefit from the podcast, and this is where you like it. One thing you could do as a value exchange is you could go on iTunes and you can leave a review and you can tell us how we're doing.
Or anywhere you leave reviews. I mean, not everybody listens to iTunes. Maybe it's
That's true.
Spotify for you or something. Somewhere where people will see that review and go, oh, maybe I should give this show a listen.
You got it. So if you leave a rating and a review, that is an act of generosity.
Yeah.
And I will feel like I'll feel a little boost of energy to keep going.
She really does, by the way. She reads these and she's like, oh, somebody gave a review. Okay, people are listening. They're getting value from this. It's like a message in a bottle, right?
Yes.
We send out. To hear back, it's like, okay, people are getting benefit. They're actually resonating with the things we say.
Well, and all the information that tells me people are listening, other than comments and that sort of thing, it's all based on algorithms. You know, it's like these are the downloads and then you'll find out later, like, oh, well, those aren't actually the real downloads. It's actually this or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's so digital and so impersonal. I'm like, is anybody actually listening? Somebody goes, oh, hey, I'm listening. I'm like, oh, awesome. Let's do another one. So if you would do that, that would be a gift to me. And we've got a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. If you leave us a rating review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. As Joel mentioned, you can get an owner's manual for your personality type. It is a
you should get one for your personality type. It's fantastic.
It's a comprehensive manual for how to navigate the world with your best fit type preferences. It's a labor of love. We spent years on them because we had to make 16 of them, and I actually think we did a pretty good job. So go pick up a copy of your personality owner's manual.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.